if you open your eyes, maybe if you visit, if you don't have a curated, make-believe, Truman Show, Potemkin Village view of the crisis at the American southern border and the existential threat that is illegal immigration, you might just understand what's happening to the United States of America. This past weekend, I did spend several days in El Paso, Texas, directly on America's southern border. I spent several days sitting right there next to the Rio Grande, sitting yards from the border wall. Man, I know this. I have always been attracted to the frontier, to the edge. So here's what I mean. Not something like overly romantic that I've always saddled up and rode west, but I know that I'm attracted to whatever seems like the border. I love sitting on the beach. I love staring out at the open ocean. Love it. I love, as my family did 2 years ago during COVID, saddling up the SUV and riding through New Mexico, South Dakota, and Montana, and Wyoming, and Idaho, and Utah, and Arizona. I love America's edge. I loved going to El Paso. There's something wild, there's something free, there's something adventurous, there's something exploratory about the edge, about the frontier, about the border. You can immediately feel that in El Paso. El Paso is a geographic outpost in the United States. I mean, not just from north to south, but from east to west. To the east of El Paso, you have a good amount of desert, and then you've got essentially the southern Great Plains. You know, they say, and we've talked about it here, that when settlers arrived at then the frontier, which today is essentially like I-35 in Texas, it's where the South turns into geographically or topographically the cross timbers region of Texas, and then quickly plays out into the grass plains. Trees become more sparse. They stopped, and you looked out at just an ocean of yellow, an ocean of grass, and of threat and danger. I mean, literally scalping the loss of human life, because all of that was Comancheria, one of the biggest Indian empires of all time. The Comanche Indians, who ruled essentially everything from northern Mexico up through Colorado, all the way from essentially roughly Waco and Austin to, well, El Paso and Albuquerque. That great swath to the east was a vast nothingness, buffalo, wild, Comancheria. And then to the west of El Paso, you're talking about desert lands of New Mexico. Not great inhabitants, not huge cities. I mean, Las Cruces, New Mexico now is about 200,000 people. Then you've got Albuquerque, another, 700,000 people, a couple of hours away. But El Paso, both north to south and east to west, is an outpost. It is on the frontier. And then it is literally on the border. But it's unique in this way. El Paso and Ciudad Juarez in Mexico are the largest, as it proclaims, the largest international or binational urban metro area in the world. It's about, again, I think if you include Las Cruces, so this greater metro area, it's about 2.7 million people. You don't think of that, right? Because if you know anything, I've always been into populations and city sizes, in part because I always was a kid thinking, who could have an NFL team? Who could support an NBA team? You think of El Paso about 500,000, which I think El Paso is 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 people. And then you give another 200 to Las Cruces, so what you're looking at is 1.5 million people or so right across the border in Juarez. And these two communities are essentially, at least through history, one. They're one and the same. Cross-border traffic off and on throughout their entire history. In a positive way, trade, families, friends, culture. They were, until very recently, one and the same, Juarez and El Paso, in not every way. Because on the Mexican side of the border, you had one of the most dangerous cities in the world. You'll remember the story from, 15 years ago or so, where just thousands and thousands of girls went missing and died in Juarez. They don't know to this day. Serial killer, exclusively cartel, what it was. But of course, cartel problems are rampant in Juarez. And El Paso, until very recently, was one of the safest cities in America. I mean that, like one of the lowest homicide rates per capita in America. But over the last several months, El Paso has gotten dangerous. Everything. Crime, human trafficking, drugs, murder, and of course, piggybacked upon the rise in illegal immigration. Joe Biden visited El Paso this past week at the same time I was there for Fox and Friends. Biden hadn't visited the border really in his career. I literally think there was a drive-by once, maybe in the 70s when he was a senator. I mean, literally a drive-by. And even this visit to El Paso was essentially a layover on Sunday of about 4 hours before going on his way down to Mexico City. Biden toured a NGO humanitarian center. He took a walk along the border wall, and he was absolutely protected from seeing the actual crisis on the American border, one which his administration denies. I mean, that's not Will Cain's characterization. That's a fact. You can listen to the sound anytime you want of, for example, Alejandro Mayorkas saying the border is secure. Well, I spent two mornings broadcasting from local time, 4 a.m. to, our show's 4 hours, so I was done by 8 a.m. on Sunday. I was done by 7 a.m. on Monday. I was there for, 7 hours between 2 days at those early hours of the morning, middle of the night. And I saw, as I was sitting there, 7 Cuban illegal immigrants cross the Rio Grande into America. National Guard, Texas DPS respond. One of them carrying a child in tow. Now, look, this is a crass metaphor, okay? This is a crass metaphor. But anybody has ever fished or hunt knows you don't just go and you just automatically see whatever it is you are fishing or hunting. And if you are looking for illegal immigrants, there are places where you can go, and they're literally there, sometimes by the thousands right across. But the vast majority of the time, it's not as though you can just walk up and go, look, a river. Nobody's crossing. Guess the border's secure. Sit there for a minute, in my case, 7 hours, and, which isn't very much time, you will see something because it's happening. In fact, I believe in the 24-hour period that essentially I was there was 500 illegal crossings counted in El Paso. 500. I saw 7. Now, that's not what Joe Biden saw, because Joe Biden had a Truman Show version of the border crisis presented to him as president. It was essentially a Potemkin village tour. You guys, and I don't want to take for granted, and I don't want to be pedantic. Do you guys remember the story of the Potemkin village? Catherine II of Russia was touring newly conquered land for Russia in the late 1700s, I think like 1787. So she was touring Crimea. Of course, you know Crimea today because of Ukraine. I believe it was her boyfriend was like a military general or diplomat type figure, and his last name was Potemkin. And he wanted to show Catherine her new lands, new Russia. And they, along with several dignitaries, went to Crimea and to that area of the world, Ukraine, and took a river tour. It's on the Dnipro River. And Potemkin had little fake villages built on the riverbanks so that when Catherine toured her new lands, she could say, oh, how quaint, how beautiful, how interesting. And then as the riverboat passed by, they would tear down the Potemkin village and run ahead with, horses and carts and whatnot, miles down the river as the slow-moving river crews would catch up and have now a newly constructed village where she'd say, oh, look at that, how quaint. Another little Potemkin village. It's become a saying, right? And it references any facade, some falsity, some fake version of the world. People have used it, and some examples, which you can see on Wikipedia, is like North Korea has entire cities built, which are fake, people don't live in, to pretend for the world. Seen them sometimes like on satellite take pictures. Example in America, they say, is I think it was in Cleveland. They have all these rundown houses that are row houses that are unoccupied, dilapidated slums, right? Well, instead of just plywood, they on the doors and the windows, they painted the plywood to look like pretty, whatever, green, blue doors and windows, all fake. A facade. Truman Show. A Potemkin village. This is what Joe Biden had presented to him at the southern border. Why? Well, first, let's talk about exactly what this represents, the reality that I saw in the 2 days that I was there. The reality is that we are setting a record every week and every month on the number of border crossings, the number of gotaways. You won't hear that reported on any news outlet other than Fox. That's not being a team, pat yourself on the back. That's reality. You don't know this exists. You do not know this crisis exists. And I heard, I believe it was General Douglas McGregor on Tucker Carlson tonight say that when it comes to the southern border, what we're dealing with is an existential threat. That's interesting when you think about it. I had this conversation with Pete Hegseth and with Emily Campagno, who was filling in for Rachel Campos Duffy. An existential threat. What does that mean? That means a threat to the existence of the United States of America. Like nuclear holocaust is an existential threat. What's not an existential threat? Say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's not an argument about whether or not we should intervene or stay out. That's just accurately describing the problem. Russia potentially taking over Ukraine in the extreme doesn't represent a threat to the existence of the United States of America. But McGregor says the threat at our southern border is an existential threat. I think he's right. And I think he's right on two accounts. First, unfettered illegal immigration is a threat to the United States of America. It just is, to our existence. Look, this is where if you shut your brain off and you simply look for offense, people can come away with whatever they want. But they won't come away with the truth, even a truth that's too obvious for them to deny to themselves. Here's what I'm saying. If I took all the Italians out of Italy, would it be Italy? If I took all of the people who were born, or forget that, if I just took everybody who's in Italy right now out of Italy, and I replaced all of those people with the people that live in South Korea, would what you call Italy, even the geography, the place of Italy, be Italy? And in reverse, would South Korea be South Korea? No, it wouldn't. I think that's obvious. The point is, a nation state is more than land. A nation state is a people. And that's not xenophobic. It certainly isn't racist. We live in a multiracial society in the United States of America, made up of customs, traditions, a way of life, a people. If you allow unfettered, unlimited, illegal immigration, you have changed, with no control, the face of your people. I mean that metaphorically. You have changed what it means to be American. Now, the United States has always been a country of immigration. But as part of that, what we've also quite honestly expected, and now for some reason, again, this is demonized or villainized, was assimilation. The acknowledgement we as America have our own cultures and traditions and ways of life, and that people that move here because of those freedoms embodied in our documents, but also our cultures and traditions and ways of life that give, life to those documents and principles that create that prosperity. And if you replace it, you're no longer America. Oh, you may call it America. It may be on the land that we say is America, but it's no longer America. And that is an existential threat. And it's why since our birth, we have had some cohesive control over immigration, meaning at times we've had quotas. We'll take this number of people from this place, or we will take this number of immigrants this year. It's never been unfettered. It's never been wide open doors. You don't open the doors to your home and say anybody that wants to come in. Why? Because it would cease to at some point become your home. You wouldn't take care of it. They wouldn't take care of it. It wouldn't be at some point your furniture, your food. It would no longer smell like your house. It would just be a different place. And so you would control. You do control how many people live at your home. Why is that different with the nation? We control the pace, the quantity of immigration. Right now, the United States of America is basically, look, I'm not going to, hyperbole doesn't help, but accuracy does. We don't have complete open borders, but if you just look at the behavior of the people that are coming, they certainly expect to come in. You come in, you claim asylum, and you get processed, and you can disappear in the United States of America. And look, the numbers are astounding. Again, record millions and millions of people. Not legal. We're talking about illegal on an annual basis. And that becomes something at some point other than America. Secondarily, it represents what's happening at our southern border, an existential threat in that the cartels are in control of Mexico. That's a fact. Mexico is a narco state. You need evidence of that. Look what's happening right now. They arrested El Chapo's son. I don't think he's one of the most important sons that El Chapo has, but it's unleashed a crazy amount of cartel violence right now in Mexico. It looks like a war zone in Mexico. What more, you and I both know, and this is a fact, like fentanyl has become, I think, the number one leading cause of death. I believe it's of adults. Can't remember exactly. It is, anecdotally, I think we're getting to a point where almost everyone, at least one-off knows someone who's died of fentanyl. And make no mistake, these are not overdoses. These are poisonings. These are flat-out poisonings. People aren't looking for fentanyl. They're looking for over-the-counter black market, over the internet, Xanax or Adderall, and they're getting fentanyl, and they die. That is poisoning, which, by the way, as we've talked about, is in league with the Chinese Communist Party, where the precursor chemicals bring all that to Mexico, all that goes into making fentanyl. I had Senator Jerry Moran on Fox and Friends of Kansas, who's on the House Intel Law Enforcement Committees in the Senate, and he told me this weekend that if you're Chinese and you're trying to illegally come into the United States of America, you essentially get the red carpet tour, black tie. You can come in a suit and tie on a boat across the river. You're not wading. You're not cold. Primo treatment. Wonder why. That's different than, say, if you're coming from Cuba. And that's another thing that's changed about this. You think of it in your head as like Mexicans looking for a better life. There are Mexican illegal immigrants, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about Venezuelan, of course, Central American. We're talking about South America. We're talking about Cuba. We're talking about Caribbean. We're talking about the Middle East. We're talking about Asia. We're talking about Russia. We're talking about people coming from everywhere, and it's under the control of the cartels. Right here on the Will Cain podcast, we had an interview. I don't remember the name of the guest off the top of my head, but he said there's only two paths for a future in which Mexico comes back under control. It's so far gone as a narco state. It's so corrupt from every level, all the way to the top, to the presidency. There's only two ways to cut out the corruption of the narco state that is Mexico and how it's run by cartels. Two ways. One, an authoritarian stands up, meaning Mexico's taken over. And acknowledging these two things isn't an endorsement. It's just an acknowledgement of help me figure another path forward. An authoritarian who coalesces power for himself, needs not answer to anyone, needs money or takes whatever he needs, and doesn't answer to a greater evil in the cartels, becomes the power that squashes the cartels in Mexico. Is that better or worse? I don't know, but it's hard to get worse than the chaos that is Mexico. If you live there, if you're a Mexican. The other, this guest said, was invasion by the United States of America. We're going in. This is a threat, an existential threat to our country. You are poisoning our population. We are coming in, and we are taking over until this threat is neutralized. Now, Look, would Mexico want that? No. Maybe. Would some Mexicans want to get rid of this plague? Maybe. But we're not dealing with that conversation right now. We're not dealing with a should or shouldn't. We're dealing with an is. The only way this gets under control, in this guest's estimation, is one of those two outcomes. By the way, if that's the case, I would offer to you that I believe Americans would care more about that potential than going to war in Ukraine. Because this one affects our daily lives. This one's at our southern border. This one's poisoning our children. This one is an existential threat to the United States of America. And it's going to have to be dealt with. What's happening in our southern border, it's going to have to be dealt with. That's not jingoism. That's not xenophobia. That's not racism. That's life. And I can tell you, having been on that frontier, been on that border, you can talk about stats, and I didn't even rattle off. I just told you it's records, and they are. They don't tell you the life. I can talk to Border Patrol, and I do, Texas DPS Border Patrol, and I respect what they tell me. I have that conversation the most. I will say I've never met a law enforcement officer who says, everything's going great, no crime, right? So I always want to get another voice, and I want the voice of the people that live it. I spoke to numerous people in El Paso. If it's important, all of them Mexican-American. 80% of El Paso is Mexican-American. Almost all of them, their parents, or them as very young children, immigrated to the United States legally from Juarez to El Paso. One community, but they became American citizens. And they sat there and they told me there's a presumption because Beto O'Rourke represented El Paso, or that this place has had Democrats, or because we're Mexican-American, that we are somehow cool with this lawlessness. And we are absolutely not. Everybody wants to be safe. Everyone wants order. Everyone wants to stare and look at the frontier, but everyone wants quality of life. This is, I believe, something that we are not going to be able to run from, stick our head in the sands as ostriches. We're not going to be able to pretend like it doesn't exist. This is one of the biggest issues facing the United States of America, right there on our border, right there on our frontier, and it is existential to the USA. Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.